Thanks everyone for being here, and we're really excited to be speaking with Pam, who is with 15 and Fairness. It's a great organization, but I'll get her to talk a little bit more about it. So Pam, if you could just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what you do and what the organization does.
Great. Well, I'm really lucky to be one of a team of people, but the primary coordinator of the Fight for 15 and Fairness. And so I've been with the campaign since the beginning actually since before the beginning, as a matter of fact. We launched under the fight to raise the minimum wage when the demand was $14 an hour. And we won an increase from $10.25 to $11. And then we relaunched under the Fight for 15 and Fairness, and the rest is history. So I've been with the campaign for a while, and it's been a real honor to work with so many incredible people, because really I'm about the only full-time staff person that's just on the campaign, and it's really comprised of people who do this on a volunteer basis because they care about the issues, and it's really driven by workers who themselves are in precarious employment. Mm-hmm. And so if the campaign looks good and is effective, it's thanks to all of those workers who have literally put their blood, sweat, and tears into it.
So one thing I wanted to ask you is, what was the employment climate like before and then after COVID hit?
Well, I think what's so interesting about COVID is that in obviously it's been an economic catastrophe. It's been a health catastrophe for literally millions of people. And so that's obviously the thing. But I think what it has done is really revealed all the weaknesses that existed before COVID struck in the labor market. So we know that precarious employment is on the rise, that, part-time work, involuntary part-time work, where people would much rather have full-time hours, but they're only able to get part-time jobs. They have to string jobs together to get enough, money to make ends meet. People don't have enough income. Even if they are lucky enough to get a full-time job, the minimum wage is not where it needs to be to provide people with a decent life. So there's all of these problems that exist. And I think it has to be absolutely said that because of racism and systemic discrimination in our labor market, the people who are overrepresented in precarious employment, in low-wage jobs, in terrible jobs, in difficult jobs, in dangerous jobs are, people of color, Black, Indigenous, racialized workers, workers with disabilities. So it's everyone who already faces enormous, challenges in society because of white supremacy, because of all of the systematic, issues at play. And then on top of that, are also are overrepresented in the worst jobs. And so one of the things that we've seen with COVID is that, for all the high fancy big salaries, it wasn't the Bay Street lawyers that were keeping us fed and clothed and cared for. It was all those frontline workers, from the farm workers. Many of them don't have citizenship status. So the farm workers who are growing our food, to the manufacturing workers who are preparing it and assembling it, to the grocery store workers, the cleaners, the delivery people, like all of these people that are on the absolute front lines of caring for us, keeping us going, the worst wages, the worst working conditions, and the most essential. Because honestly, no one missed the absence of the Bay Street lawyers. No one missed the absence of the CEOs and so forth. And many of them went off to their private islands to, weather the storm. Right. So really and I think there's been a new appreciation for all the people who are putting themselves in the front lines. So I would say that's what COVID has done. But I think it's also really important to say that because those workers are on the front lines, it's been more people of color, more Black workers have died. When you think about personal support workers, it's been women workers, Black workers, racialized workers that have been, contracted COVID, have died. When you think about the first health worker, it was actually a cleaner with no paid sick days. When you actually look at who's not only paying the price in terms of work and wages, they're paying the price with their health as well. And it has been, a terrible tragedy for everyone. And it really is, I think more people are now recognizing that precarious employment, right? But precarious employment on its own is actually a public health crisis for the workers involved directly, but also for the public, because when you saw what happened in the long-term care homes, there was an absolute explosion. And why was that? Because part-time work, people having to go around to working at different homes and accidentally spreading the disease or the contagion. You have people who are poorly paid, already have pre-existing health conditions, all of those things. And to be honest, I'm scared right now because we're about to, schools are about to open, and the exact same problems with precarious employment are at the heart of our education system. And there's a real danger that we hit go, and that is going to spread COVID into every community, not just in Ontario, but across the country.
Yeah, so, you make really good points. Like, I really like how you've explained how this is systemic and how everything affects everything else. We do not live in bubbles, and everything we do, our choices, our behaviors affect other people around us, especially when it comes to employment and when it comes to, now there's a pandemic that we have to deal with already on top of a broken system.
Exactly. And that's exactly it. When you look at what was happening with farm workers, when it went from a handful of cases where we were raising the alarm bells, and then it literally exploded to hundreds and thousands of people, and the people who died unnecessarily. And then to have a government basically say, if you don't show symptoms, you can go to work.
Right.
So literally, it's a death sentence for people. They can't socially distance in their working conditions. The living conditions are completely appalling. And so there's no possibility for workers to protect themselves. So one aspect of decent work for all is also about full citizenship rights for all. Absolutely. Because it's one thing, we're all scared about our boss, if we upset the boss and what's going to happen, and not having, security in our work. But imagine if you were going to be, exited the country, if you exercise your legal rights to decent work,
On top of dealing with racism and dealing with how they're being treated, how those bosses can take advantage of migrant workers. It's frustrating, and they shouldn't be under that position, because people who are in Canada who are benefiting from their work are not recognizing how problematic it is for them.
Totally. And actually, the other thing about it as well is that we need those workers in our movement, because they come with huge amounts of experiences, a huge amount of knowledge to contribute to our movements. And every time somebody gets deported, because then it weakens our movement as well. And so we need all the workers in the fight. So not only do they grow our food, which is in the first instance, it is the most fundamental thing. And we should be treating people like gold. And the fact that these, commercial farms are getting away with, such substandard working conditions. I mean, it's interesting to know that farm workers are exempted from most of the Employment Standards Act. So that's a shocking thing too, is that there's not even a legal minimum wage for people who work on farms. So there's many holes in the existing laws. And that's part of why, it's hard for people to organize to affect change, because the moment people start affecting change, they're deported. And for those workers, they have to fight even harder, because there's not the same, employment standards that exist for other workers in precarious work. So we all have an interest. Our movement would be, would be like all of us. If we had a bit of job security, we'll have more agency in our lives, which means we can participate more fully in the movements, which means we can be more engaged and so forth. And that goes for all workers. So it's a total self-interest. It's like we need those workers to be well cared for and have safe and healthy working conditions, because they grow our food. And also because we need them as part of our movement to be actually helping to make working conditions better for everyone. Because that's the ironic thing, is that when we win improvements for people who are in the most vulnerable circumstances, it actually has the knock-on effect of benefiting everybody. Like when we raise the floor of wages, then even people who are around those, suddenly it's like, well, if you're going to pay me this much and you're going to pay me this much, I'm going to go someplace else and then employers have to bump the wages up, for other people who are in those, in that wage range. So it does have the effect of raising the floor of wages and working conditions, not just for minimum wage earners, but also for everybody. And it even makes it easier for unions to bargain better and even higher standards in their collective agreement. Because, let's say we want a $15 minimum wage, then unions, that would be the starting point, and then unions could bargain for wages that are higher than that. As it stands, about 10% of union members earn less than $15 an hour. And so, and it's not their fault, it's just because when the floor of wages and working conditions are disintegrating, it's actually harder for unions to win better wages and and benefits for their members. So the whole thing, like you were saying earlier, it really does fit, connect. And the more that we raise the bottom up, the more it has the effect of kind of rising all boats. Maybe not so much for the people at the top, but that's all right, because they can just hang out.
They'll be fine. I'm sure they'll.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that's such a good point too, because one thing that I try to hammer home, especially with research that I've done, is when we do help people who are most vulnerable, is an investment in people. This is not costing money per se, because in the long term, when we're all doing well, it's costing the system less. Like, I don't know why people have this hard time getting their heads around that, but
it's so true. That is a really important point, and especially COVID, I think, has helped to shine a light on that. With paid sick days, for example, like oftentimes you get the big business lobby groups like the Chambers of Commerce and the Canadian Federation of Independents, of independent businesses. They tend to represent small businesses, but they mostly represent big business interests. So they say, oh, we can't afford to pay paid sick days. But actually, if you look at the experience in other jurisdictions, if it's exactly that, like when we can reduce contagion, when people don't come to work and spread it around, the workplaces are more productive, the community is more healthy, and that not only makes businesses more productive, it actually reduces overall healthcare costs for everyone. So it really, just like you say, it's just so obvious that it's an investment not in someone else, it's an investment in our own self. Like, it's not, we don't even have to be, charitable for this. We can be self-interest, because it's like when I know my neighbors, have good childcare, if my neighbors are going to have paid sick days, I know that they're not going to be, going to work sick and potentially giving me, whatever illness they have. So I benefit when my neighbors are well taken care of, and it's pretty obvious.
You did mention the, paid sick days. You mentioned the Employment Standards Act. I don't know if there's anything else that you would like to say around maybe what the city or the province or federally could be done more than what's being done right now for work.
Well, there's so much that could be done provincially and federally for all workers. The really disappointing thing is that when we had fought so hard to make some pretty important but modest improvements in the employment standards legislation under the previous government. So we had actually won a path to a $15 minimum wage. We had won not many paid sick days, but we had, for the first time, we were the first jurisdiction to win 2 paid sick days for all workers. We had equal pay for full-time and part-time workers, because there's a real trend that full-time workers get a higher wage, very often get a higher wage and full benefits, and then the part-time workers come in, they do the same jobs. They literally sometimes sit side by side a full-time worker and get half the wage and none of the benefits. So we've gotten legislation around this. We got fair scheduling provisions. We got quite a few things that would make a real difference in people's lives. But unfortunately, when the Ford government got in, he put a stop to quite a number of those changes, not everything, but for example, he canceled the $15 minimum wage. So we got to 14 and it was supposed to be $15, I think 2 years ago now. And in fact, they kept the indexation, which is something we won. So we had won the provision whereby every year the minimum wage is adjusted to keep up with rising prices, because prices go up, but then if wages stay the same, it's almost like having a wage cut, because it doesn't so prices go up and up and up. And so we were able to win that automatic adjustment. We never call it a minimum wage increase, because it's not really an increase. It's just holding its value. It's so it's an adjustment. Exactly.
Always trying to catch up.
Exactly. So Ford kept that, and so that first adjustment, since he's scrapped the $15 minimum wage, is coming into effect October 1st. So the minimum wage will become $14.25. But what that minimum wage should have been, had Doug Ford not scrapped the $15, that wage would have been $15.65 as of October 1st, because we would have had two cost of living adjustments under our belts by the time October 1st comes along. So anyway, so those are just examples of what governments really could be doing. But in this moment, I am completely shocked that in the midst of a global pandemic, that no level of government has moved to provide the kind of paid sick days that the evidence shows are needed.
Right.
And even in response to the campaign, the federal government did create this thing called sickness benefits. It's a new sort of benefits program, but it's temporary. It's only for 1 year. And it looks as though it's only for people who have some sort of COVID-related symptom. And it's basically a situation where you get up to 2 weeks you'll get 2 weeks over a whole year that you can get $500 a week, but you have to basically get it in a 1 week clump. And you can only get it after you've lost 60% of your wages. And one of the things that we keep saying is that if you're really on the edge, you can't have even you can't be a day late with your paycheck. You can't risk losing $1 because it might mean whether you make rent, it might mean whether or not you can put dinner on the table for the kids, or, all of those things. So what generally happens for workers that, if there's a barrier, if there's any question about income, they just go to work sick. That's just what happens. Yeah. And very often they'll send, through no fault of their own, because they absolutely have to get to work. If their child is sick, they often have to send them to school because they can't leave them at home by themselves. They have to go to work. So the sick kids get sent to school. Well, that's going to be an absolutely unmitigated disaster. And it really shocks me that we have a system where there's been no legislative sick days, provincially or federally. So that's one thing that I feel is, everything is urgent, but the paid sick days is absolutely urgent right now. If every parent doesn't have paid sick days, if every worker in the education system or the healthcare system or whatever system doesn't have paid sick days, it means they can't stay home when at the first sign of a symptom. And that's what every health professional is recommending now. Even if it's the sniffles, they're saying, if your kid has the sniffles, keep them home. If you have the sniffles, stay home. But there's no conception that the recent evidence shows that about 70% of the workforce has no paid sick days. So it's terrifying. So imagine a kid gets screened at school and says, you can't come to school. They get put in some sort of quarantine room. But how is the parent supposed to come and get the kid with that? And then I'll just say, I also am an organizer with the Workers Action Center, and we get workers in all the time before COVID who would come in and say, I had to pick my kid up from school and had to leave work early, and I let my boss know, and I had a message waiting for me when I got home saying, you're done. And people basically get fired, and there's very little, protection for workers. So this is what we're up against before COVID. I can't imagine what's going to start happening in this particular context. So we really do need to urge the government to move on paid sick days as a matter of protecting the public as our own interest.
Right. And everything you've said really, there's so many points that point to the ways in which government are roadblocks, their policies, their stipulations with all of this, in terms of employment standards and sick days and all these kind of things. And then how people tend to individually put blame on the individual. Well, just stay home. Don't go to work sick. Just stay home. But you're being so selfish, and this is the point that I'm really happy that you made, is that so many times in these situations, people overlook the systemic reasons for why people are doing what they're doing. And it's showing how many barriers there are for people to live their lives, to live them happily, to be taken care of, which in turn takes care of the rest of us. And so many people are spending their time fighting at each other and not looking towards the systemic structural problems that are causing a lot of these issues.
You're so right. And I kind of blame the 1%, because in some ways they're the ones that are making out like actually like bandits from all of this. Like the thing that also really upsets me about just even the federal government's, sick benefits provision. I mean, some workers will be able to access it, and that's a good thing. But it's a subsidy for corporations like Loblaws and Walmart that literally made out like bandits over the course of COVID-19. It is not the case that every single business is struggling. Yeah. In fact, as restaurants closed and people, were, in lockdown, people were cooking more and more and more at home. So grocery stores were running out of stock. So yeah, there's a lot of corporations, wealthy corporations that made out like bandits who should be providing decent wages, paid sick days, and all the other things that go along with decent work as a matter of law. And the fact that we are shoveling more public money into subsidizing these corporations.
Or bailouts.
I totally agree. It just makes me outraged. I can, there's some micro businesses that are, really on the edge. And I think it also has to be said that because of racism and discrimination in the workforce, there's a lot of small businesses that people have had to start because they can't actually get a toehold in the labor market. So they're in some fairness to small businesses, there are people on the edge. And I fully support making a provision to support those businesses. But you can't let the businesses that are doing just fine, thank you very much, they should not be let off the hook from providing decent wages and working conditions. So that's my little rant for, I'm sure there'll be a few more before this interview is over, but that's one aspect that just really bothers me so much. And like you say, these are systemic things, but they don't have to be that way. And I think your point about people blaming each other is really important, because I think the 1% has convinced us all that everything on earth is scarce. There's no money, there's no jobs, there's not enough. And so if we open up our doors to newcomers, somehow there's not going to be enough for all of us. And they are very good at peddling this myth of scarcity, when there is not an iota of danger that there is scarcity. There's a problem with people being able to, there's a problem with distribution. Maybe that's a better way of putting it. People who don't have the money to buy the stuff that's produced, and some of the stuff that's produced is not needed. So in terms of like distributing fairly what is already produced, there is a problem there, but it has nothing whatsoever to do with scarcity. It has everything to do with the 1% that are basically like hoarding all the money and all the resources and polluting our planet at the same time. So if we can unpack the scarcity piece, all of a sudden, it's even like jobs. There was this beautiful anecdote I heard of it might have been even an anecdote from Van Jones, who's a leader in the U.S. and was on the cutting edge of the environmental climate jobs and so forth for a while. But he told the story of a friend of his who had been looking for work, couldn't find anything, and came home to say to the kids, I couldn't find any work. I'm really sorry, I couldn't find any work. And his little girl looked up and said, "Gee, Daddy, does that mean all the work is done?" And it was just one of those things. Of course, all the work is not done, but only certain jobs get created. Only certain jobs are actually remunerated. And there's all kinds of work that absolutely needs to be done that isn't a quote unquote job, that isn't remunerated or isn't remunerated adequately. So healing the planet, caring for children, like all the jobs that actually need to be done are not, it's a struggle to get them done. And then the jobs that, are not needed, then, they're handsomely rewarded, So, so you're totally right that that people get pitted against each other. And in some ways, that's why the 1% stays in power, because as long as we're fighting with each other, we're not looking up and saying, wait a minute.
Hey,
wait a minute. That's not fair.
Why are all the laws on your side? What's going on here?
Yes, exactly.
And I guess, can you talk about some of the myths that are associated with raising the minimum wage? Like what's kind of fact and what's fiction?
Oh, that's such a good question. And that is another way the 1% convinces, like, tries to persuade us that the things that are right and just and fair are not somehow in our interest.
Mm-hmm.
So on the one hand, you have to have high salaries to attract the best talent for all those CEOs. And when they, mess up and get exited from the company, they have their golden parachutes and all of that. But oh my gosh, if minimum wage earners are to get, $1 more an hour, that is going to be an almighty disaster. Exactly. So I'll just unpack the myths. The first myths that come along is, if workers' wages increase, then prices are just going to go up, and then we're going to be no better off. So wages go up $1, and then everything else goes up $1, and then we're basically no better off. Well, that's not actually factually true. When the minimum wage was frozen for 12 of the 20 years between 1995 and 2015, there was no shortage of price increases, whether it was, housing or gas or food or anything like that. So it's absolute malarkey. What happened in those periods of time is that people lost purchasing power. So it is absolutely not the case that wages drive price increases, but without wages keeping up with price increases, then we're all going to be in bad shape. So that's one myth. Another myth is that if wages go up, then we're all going to be replaced by robots. And so, robots will take your job. So, robots work all day and all night and they never complain and so forth. So we had to go and, it's funny because as you take on one myth and then a new one pops up. And so we had to kind of go back and teach ourselves and try and figure out what's happening. So this whole automation, and it turns out that if you actually unpack the data, automation doesn't exactly it doesn't reduce jobs, it displaces jobs. And by that, and a really good way of explaining that is to look at what happened in New Zealand with the use of kiosks.
Right.
So in New Zealand, they were kind of on the cutting edge of using kiosks and apps and all of this for their fast food outlets. And so what they found, for example, like when they introduced, the idea is get rid of, cashiers or whatever, just like input your order. And then, and then we can get rid of all these workers that way. Mm-hmm. Well, it turns out that when you accelerate the inputting of orders, it also has the effect of accelerating production at the back end. So for every cashier that was done away with, you needed more people in the back to actually prepare the food. But then you have this other problem where once people have put their orders in and they're waiting for their order, then they're all milling around going, is it ready yet? Is it ready yet? And so then they had to actually bring people in to act as hosts, to invite people to sit down and wait while their orders were being prepared. And then instead of having people jumping up and going to the counter to say, is it ready yet? Even if they were sitting, then they had to reintroduce table service so that people would stay in their seats until their orders were ready. So then they had to bring more people in. And then there's the whole tech problems of people vandalizing them because they would get so frustrated when they didn't work. And so then they had to bring in security. And then they had the smarty pants high school kids that are like messing with the app and getting, their 30 Big Macs for the price of one or whatever, like all of those kind of the hacking things that happen. And so in the end, what they really found is that there was no real advantage to having this technology. But there was one advantage for the fast food outlets and which is why that people had to eventually invest in it or else go under, is that it turns out that people are much more inclined to supersize the fries if they're inputting that order into a machine as opposed to a human being. And so it had the effect of increasing the orders, but it didn't have the effect of reducing jobs. So, and you could imagine that once one business has introduced that technology, if the next business doesn't follow suit, it's going to be at a competitive disadvantage. So, and that's another reason why the system itself kind of drives inefficiencies, because it turns out it's not really efficient at all. Mm-hmm. But if they all don't do it, someone's going to go under down the road.
Mm-hmm. So that actually brings me to the last question, Pam. What do we do? What do we do, Pam? So in your opinion, how can people take action? What can they do?
Well, right now, if you go to 15infairness.org, there's a couple of petitions on the go. One of the things that we've been really pushing on around the federal government has been around the income supports for the very reason that you identified earlier. That, you know, what we learned is that workers need at least $500 a week as a bare minimum. Like, we can't live on less than that. And so the new strategies that the federal government has just announced, it's going to provide $500 a week for people who have to care, you know, they can't work because they have a dependent child or someone in their family that needs caregiving related to COVID-19. So they're going to get $500 a week. If you have to avail yourself of the 2 weeks of sickness benefits because of COVID, you're going to get $500 a week. But for some reason, they've said, but if you just lose your job because of, if you lose your job, you're only entitled to $400 a week. And that's definitely not enough for people to live on. So we're really trying to push the federal government to do better. We were heartened by the changes it announced for employment insurance, because the changes they announced really will make them make employment insurance more accessible for people. But it's got to have that minimum amount of weekly support. Like, we can't live on less than $500. And what we've been basically saying is that all workers need at least $500, either through wages, so raise the minimum wage, so either through wages, either through whatever social program, whether it's employment insurance or whether it's ODSP or social assistance or old age security for that matter,
right.
Or employment insurance. All workers need at least that. So we're asking people to move on that. Now is a really important time because the federal government has kind of prorogued the parliament, ended this session of the parliament. So they're making all sorts of decisions right now about what they're going to do on a go forward basis. So now's the time to make our voices heard. And I would say provincially to keep talking to people about the issues. But honestly, the paid sick days, I feel like that is a really crucial health issue right now. Mm-hmm. And if people can go to the website and take action, that would be fantastic. So it's 15andfairness.org. But the main thing I think is to really be building links, talking to friends and neighbors about it. And, even if we get small steps forward, it makes a real difference in people's lives. Moving from, $11.65 an hour to $14. For some people, that may not have sounded like a lot, but for many people, I talk to workers that, the woman who cuts my hair basically said that was the first wage increase she'd ever had, and she'd worked there for more than 10 years. So, so these things do make a real difference. And if we can support each other, get involved in the movement for decent work. If, in my humble opinion, if you want to get involved in a good campaign, Fight for 15 and Fairness is a really good one, and we value every contribution. And we can build a movement that supports each other to do that. And I really love the slogan, we keep each other safe. And I think that's what we really have to go forward. If we are keeping each other safe, if we're looking after our friends, families, and neighbors, then that's 90% of the battle.
Right. No, that's amazing. Thank you so much. This was an amazing interview. I learned quite a bit. So thanks so much for your perspectives.